Hello and welcome to Digital Discussions presented by Peaky Digital. I'm your host Adam, and today I am joined by Florence.
Hiya.
Welcome to the podcast. How nervous are you on this fine
I'm all right.
day?
I'm all right. I had a sleepless night last night, but we're there now.
You're one of a very large group at this point. I am quite the interviewer, Paxman-esque even. Just to start off with, Florence, could you give us a rundown of what your day to day is? What is your line of work? What does from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. What does Florence do?
So I'm a freelance PR and communications consultant, which is catchy. And outside of walking the dog and going to the gym and all those things that you always see on a kind of TikTok, my 5 to 9 before my 9 to 5. And from my 9 to 5, my main job is to liaise with journalists, stakeholders, various different kind of parties to make sure that brands get their stories told in an authentic and valuable way.
It's funny you should bring up the TikToks 5 to 9s. Do you think they're the most toxic things in the world?
I do, but I also love them.
Yeah, do you not even think they're even like remotely accurate to what's going on?
Oh no, absolutely.
But no one's getting up at 5 a.m. Surely to make these they're overnight oats.
Yeah,
leave them overnight.
Exactly.
Don't make them at 5 o'clock in the morning.
And also sometimes they do inspire me to be like a bit. I wake up and walk the dog at normally about 6:30, which is fine. But I'm thinking, what am I missing out in that hour and a half? Yeah.
And did you find anything insightful from that hour and a half that you could be doing? No, exactly. It lasts for a day and that's it. So as a trend with the Peaky podcast, a lot of the guests that we've had on, their prior experience to their line of work now has absolutely nothing to do with it. Are you going to break that trend for us?
I am. I actually did start my early days working in cafes around Truro and loved it. I moved from university. I went to Cardiff and studied sociology. So actually that's a bit rogue. But actually worked at Falmouth University in their communications department for 3 months as an intern, and then moved up to London for another internship where I actually stayed just over a year. Not that long, but before I got headhunted for an agency in Cornwall and moved down. I've been in PR for, coming up to 9 years, which... Does
it feel like 9 years?
I still feel like I'm 18 and I still act like I'm 18 sometimes. So, it doesn't.
So what was it like doing your internship in London? Like, you grew up in Cornwall, you've, as you said, worked in these cafes in and around Truro, which I'm sure is vastly different, despite being a city, technically. What was it like doing an internship in London and sort of the culture shock?
Yeah, I moved when I was 21, so I was really young, and actually all of my friends did sandwich years at university, so my core friendship group weren't in London. They were still at uni, and those that were starting salaries of like £45,000 in law and PR, despite what anyone tells you, even on these TikToks. That's no starting salary.
Is it not?
No, funnily enough. So my experience, I'm insanely grateful for Diana at Massey, actually, who took me under her wing. Kind of, it was a bit of a classic. You know, my dad's friend knew someone, and it was actually him that started the agency, and then his daughter Diana heads up the travel department. I look back on it so fondly. I lived in Wandsworth and I worked just off Bond Street, so it's kind of two pretty iconic London locations.
You've done well there.
Yeah, but the joy for me is that I now know London really well, and I go up kind of once every 6 weeks. All my friends and family, my brother's up there, and so actually being from Cornwall and having the ability to go up to London and know it really well definitely helped.
Yeah. So you said that you worked in travel PR for that. You don't necessarily work directly in travel PR now. What was it like working in travel? That was your first experience, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What was it like as your sort of welcome to the PR world?
Pretty incredible. I looked at the Massey website and there was a picture of a hotel in the Maldives, and I was like, this is me. Fresh out of uni, I was like, this is me, take me. And I worked on some really cool projects, actually, launching a Shangri-La hotel in Mauritius.
Nice.
I didn't actually ever get to go to any of them, but it was incredible learning about the difference of doing an international hotel in UK press, and we specialised in UK press. And having said that, I then worked on Penzance, which is obviously slightly closer to home, but Penzance Bid, and we relaunched the Jubilee Pool. So one of my favourite pieces of coverage, actually, still to this day, is the front cover of the Guardian travel section with a massive picture of the Jubilee Pool. Nice. And that's kind of, for me, that was an area, obviously, geographically, that I knew really well. And it balanced out I think people do get quite het up on thinking that you go to these beautiful places and
you're just going to be invited on these trips.
And actually travel PR and PR in general just isn't like that anymore. Sadly, alas, I never got to go to Mexico.
Influencers, that's what it's for.
Exactly. I need to change jobs.
Realign. So before we get into some really strong and deep questions about the world of PR, we're going to go into some equally strong questions about Florence. Okay, so we're going to start with, which do you prefer, a night in or a night out?
I am a massive socialite, so I love a night out.
Okay, let me go one more on that. Pub or club?
Oh, in my old age, pub.
Tea room.
Tea room. But equally, there is a time and a place for Sailors Club, and I stand by that.
Yeah, I actually would agree with you.
Yeah.
Another one of the questions is, what is your go-to comfort show?
So I have a few.
So on a Sunday morning after you've been to the pub, what is the comfort show?
Yeah. I've got a few. I'm not actually, controversially, I'm not a huge TV film series watcher. No. But having said that, I do love Derry Girls. Friday Night Dinner and The US Office are my three kind of, I could watch all of them.
Did you like the UK Office?
I wasn't as much of a fan. Controversial.
One of those, I feel like you start with US Office and then you graduate to...
Oh, graduate. Okay.
You'll get there one day.
One day.
And finally, what is your go-to takeaway? What's the favourite takeaway? What are you having on a Friday night?
I actually live in Newquay and I love Thai. So we have a really good Thai takeaway called Mams, and I'm very worried. There are rumours that she might be moving back to Thailand.
No.
I know. So actually, it's a bit of a sore subject, but we'll move.
Well, supposedly Thai and St Ives is supposed to be really good. Yeah. Have you been?
I have. It is really good. Slightly far for the old Friday night takeaway.
I live in St Ives. I've not been.
Yeah. Oh my god. Okay, that is a shock. Yeah, no, it is amazing.
Yeah. I'm not huge on Thai food. Although I'm not sure I've properly tried it. What's the order? If I'm going?
Okay, a beef massaman. A beef massaman.
Okay.
A pad thai. They do a really good chicken. I always say satay, but then everyone takes satay. Yeah. Satay. They do a good Penang. I mean, you could order anything from a Thai as long as it's not like the jungle curry, which is spicier than a vindaloo. Then I think you'll be all right.
We'll try something again. We're gonna get into the nitty gritty here, and we're gonna start talking about Florence and Fable, your PR agency, business, brand, everything under the sun. Many tricks. The first question I want to start with is, if you had to explain your industry and your work to someone who has little to no knowledge of what you do, how would you explain it?
So PR is slightly different from marketing in that it's editorial. So it's all kind of, it's all earned media. And so within that, I help brands communicate externally the messages that they want to at the right time and to their target audiences. So it's quite specific. But yeah.
That's it's pretty simple in that sort of simple in like explanation, but when it actually comes to it, there's so much work that needs to be put into doing it. I feel like that's something that a lot of people don't really understand about PR. Especially like they think, it's just send off an email and it'll be on the front page of the Times tomorrow morning. Yeah. And it's not necessarily that easy.
And it's also really hard to explain. Like I was just saying, it's actually really difficult. I know what I do. Of course I know what I do. I've spent the best part of 9 years doing it.
Under the beating lights of the studio.
With cameras all around you. It's really, it's quite difficult to explain because I think people don't understand how when editorial pieces come out, it's under a journalist byline and it's never my name is never attached to a piece. So trying to explain that to, for example, my brother who works in finance and everything's pretty black and white. Yeah, it's not process, like that.
Yeah, I get that. It's like if you ever try to explain your job, especially for me working in digital, trying to explain my job to my grandparents, I just said Google. I basically work for Google. That's all I do. Yeah, so you've secured coverage in Forbes, GQ, and you've said that your Penzance BID Jubilee Pool was one of your highlights, one of your favourite pieces of coverage. Have there been other pieces that are like standout campaigns to you?
Yeah, I think I'm really lucky actually. I've worked in my previous agencies and now across some incredible clients. One of my biggest highlights actually from when I went freelance in 2020. Yeah, that was right. I was like, do I need to think about that again?
Year of COVID as well.
2020, yeah, year of COVID. Move. I got made redundant and then went straight. Yeah,
that's bold.
Yeah, less bold,
forced bold.
But yeah, forced bold, but also really scary. Yeah. Would not recommend. But I worked with a lovely company who are actually based in Pontsnooth, so just around the corner from us now.
Nice.
And they're called Drinks by Post, and they had an Airstream bar, and all of a sudden, obviously, all of their weddings were cancelled, all their events, so they went into doing cocktails by post, and they brought out the most beautiful crackers. And it sounds so silly, but doing product placement around Christmas is, for any PR, actually a bit of a nightmare. Yeah, it's so competitive. And
would make sense.
Yeah, it's Christmas and it's product placement, and that's what everyone wants over Christmas. But within kind of a 3-month campaign, we got 54 pieces of coverage. And yeah, in the likes of, we looked at different pages, and I think that's also where PR can be really good, because you can be really targeted. So instead of just doing the kind of lifestyle pages, we looked at the interior magazines, because they were talking about how to lay a table for Christmas and thinking slightly outside the box. So we got some really nice interiors piece of coverage, which was great. I've also just launched Pizza Jockeys in Falmouth,
nice.
new pizza restaurant. It's so exciting. Again, the campaigns that I do tend to be quite targeted. So it's never really the scattergun approach. That was a really good one. And then kind of on a business level, I work with Cornish Premier Pasties and Prima bakeries, and we did some really good kind of storytelling about their growth and about their expansion to the Prima shop in Scoria. And that again has yielded some really good results for them as a business, but in a slightly different, less glossy kind of GQ Telegraph Forbes, because they're all great. But I think dependent on client, depends on the win.
Yeah, I suppose you do have to justify it to your clients when they come to you, if they don't necessarily know, the benefits of digital of PR, that they think if we just go for absolutely everyone, if we're like somewhere in the Times, we're somewhere in the Guardian, but you have something that's not even relevant to the readers of there, how do you explain it to them in like, it's about going to the right publications and not necessarily every publication? So
this is a bit of a lesson as to how I start with all of my clients, but I build target media lists, and that I think some people can see as a bit of a teaching you to suck eggs, but actually it's really interesting when you lay out a target media list, and then so my job is to look at the different slots and to see where the different stories can go in the slots. And so, for example, a lot of the time, especially if it's a food and drink product, we'll be like, I want to be in Sainsbury's magazine and I want to be in Waitrose Food. Well, that's great, but unless you've got Sainsbury's listings and Waitrose listings, you can't. So, and that's just like an editorial, unless they're stocked in those two, in those supermarkets.
Why on earth would they advertise something they don't have? Yeah, exactly. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And so actually so there's a lot, it's a big learning curve for a lot of people that actually, and a lot of the time, for example, the Financial Times weekends supplement, they don't really cover UK travel. And so for UK hotels, my job is to know the media, and I do, but trying to tell that to someone who all they want is the front page of the FT, slightly tricky.
Coming up. So you mentioned sort of liaising with journalists, and I don't know how much, as I think I know a little bit about PR. I know enough for my line of work, not even close to the scale that you do it on. But how do you build these sort of links with journalists over time, and how do you get the coverage? Is there a you've got a set amount of journalists or set list of journalists even that you go to and go, I've worked with you before, can they trust you at this point? Is it sort of how it works?
I guess I kind of alluded to it earlier. So I pull together a target media list, and every client's different, so every media list is therefore different, and it's looking at the slots that are available and that are run, so kind of those weekly slots and the monthly slots if it's a magazine, and working out who's writing them and who's going. I'm lucky, I've been working in PR for 9 years, so I do have a really good list of contacts. contacts. Equally though, having said that, there's been, and I think this is partly down to COVID as well, there's been a huge rise in freelancers, and actually that's a really interesting part of the mix, is that freelancers can write for multiple publications. So actually having freelancers on board is much more valuable now, because you can get a story.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, isn't it?
They can pitch it out to quite a few titles, potentially, if the story's right. So yeah, for me, my kind of black book of journalists are people that I've worked with before, because there is that trust element. But there's also, I think people are so quick to just, especially if you're doing PR in-house and don't really know what you're doing, and just kind of email news@theguardian.co.uk. And actually having this targeted approach is so important, and knowing, and it's that expertise, and it comes over time, knowing the slots, knowing what the journalists are interested in, and actually knowing their passion. So for example, I've just started working with Rupert Cooper of Philly Way, who's an ex-professional rugby player. So actually there's a really nice link there to quite a lot of those men's health magazines, and kind of that kind of where the editors or the sub-editors or the commissioning editors or just the editorial assistants have an interest in rugby. So instantly you've got that connection, but you wouldn't know that unless you know them.
No, that is true. So when it comes sort of like the key to building that relationship, would you say it is trying your best, like, you know, doing the hard yards and getting to know what the journalist is actually, and the editors are actually going to like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a huge part of it, and something that I thread through my business as well, is being human about it. I think everyone's so easy to be very corporate and very kind of, stiff upper lip in that sense of just like, we're PRs and this is what you say what else we do. But PRs need journalists and journalists need PRs. And actually being quite human. And so for example, there was, I was speaking to a journalist the other day, and she'd said that she was just trialling, she was doing Veganuary, and I have just worked with I work with Truffle Hunter, and they've just brought out a vegan black truffle mayo, and so she can't cover she can't cover the item, but actually just saying, look, whilst you're trying it, why don't you snazz up your kind of and having that rapport with journalists where you know ins and outs of their personal life as well, is really important, because it means that you do become, it's almost like you become these weird work friends, like colleagues. Well, you are colleagues.
I suppose it actually goes back to you saying that you're like a huge social, like you just want to be around people. Have you seen like that, because your personality is like that you found the advantage when it comes to gaining that coverage?
Yeah, a lot of people that know me will be rolling their eyes right now, which is but yeah, it is absolutely. I think you have to be a people person to be in PR, because you are constantly, I mean, you are a people pleaser. I'm a people pleaser through and through, and that's it.
And when do you want it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's managing expectations that comes along with that, but actually, in the first instance, it is about making sure that you are approachable as well. And I think I've always been quite keen to thread parts of my personality through my business, because it shows that, you know, a lot of my products, and I only really take on clients that I believe in and that I would use in my own life, and that's almost treading influencer there, but
you'll be on those trips soon.
I can't wait. But yeah, it's, for me, that's really important, that there is that authenticity as well.
Yeah, it's funny you should bring up authenticity, because my next question actually feeds into how you pitch these bits of coverage. So I obviously did a bit of a dive onto your website, onto your socials, to see what was going on in the world of Florence. I did notice the GQ testimonial about
lovely Paul Henderson.
Did you have to ask him to do that, or was that like?
I worked with Paul actually for quite a few press trips. And he had links to Cornwall, which is actually how I first got to know him. And he's got 2 children, a wife, and a really lovely dog called Ziggy.
I don't think I could tell you that much about half the people I've known for like a long time.
So I worked with Paul, and he actually isn't at GQ anymore. He's starting something very exciting up. But yeah, I think I messaged him and I just said, you know, I'm going I'm going freelance.
Running it on your own.
Yeah. Please can you help me? It's like, of course I can give you a testimonial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you like 3?
Yeah. So yeah, again, it's just about, I'm really lucky, journalists as well. It's a very different sphere. It's not friendship. You won't, although some of my friends are journalists, and that's come through work as well. But I also really appreciate that there's a working relationship there, but that doesn't have to mean that you see them every time you go up to London, or for example, but just staying in touch. And actually, I guess that's the power of social as well, is that it's much more, it's easier to stay in touch. Exactly. Yeah. And so I know exactly what Paul and Marilyn and the kids are doing, which is great. And, one of my best friends now is, I got to know through work, and I got to know through, she's a travel journalist for The Sun. And, I now speak to her. Lucky for her, every day.
I'm sure she's chuffed.
Yeah.
So to circle back to what makes a good pitch. So when you go in front of these nationals, how, where does the process start? And, where do you go with a client and go, right, well, I need this, and this from you to make this pitch good enough? Yeah.
So it starts with the target media list. Say it again, one more time for the target media list.
It's going to be the title of this podcast, target media list.
But from that, we then work out the slots. And then it sits on me actually to look through the news agenda, monitor upcoming trends, and different, things that can influence pitches. So for example, we were talking yesterday about the potential of there being a seafood piece for Rupert, because there's a massive influx of octopus. I was going to say octopusi. I don't know octopuses.
We can run with that if you want.
But there's a massive influx of octopus, and actually looking at is that an actual trend, or is that just kind of a story in terms of an actual story, but and how we can then develop that to be into recipes or something else, and working in that sphere of being able to look at what the news agenda is running on, kind of being one step ahead as well. So having almost making trends and making things be like that, and then getting commentary, imagery, videography. Obviously, Joe from Bull and Wolf. You're welcome.
Oh boy.
But having really strong photography for me is really important, especially for print. For online, obviously, video is really helpful, but it can't be too branded, which no one ever really understands. The joy of editorial.
So sort of to finish off this segment, I was going to ask you if you've got like a fun analogy. I don't know, because I know you said you've had sleepless nights over this. How long have you spent thinking about this analogy? So if someone came to you, asked you to justify putting their budget into PR and getting to the coverage, how would you, say it to them?
Okay.
Have you come up with an analogy? It's what I'm wondering here.
We were actually talking about this in the office. I work in a co-working space, and one of my really, really good friends works in film, and I was going through the questions, and I was like, I've been asked for an analogy, and my analogy was, it's like the parsnips on a roast, like it's part of the core fundamentals of it. His analogy was, it's the popcorn at a movie. It's like,
that's better, because I don't like parsnips. I don't like parsnips. Sorry.
Well, Ted, you win.
Yeah.
It's part of the core mix. So you can't go to a film without a snack. You can't have a roast without parsnips, although apparently you can.
You can. It's delightful. Thanks for asking.
And it's part of the wider mix, and I think the more people understand that it feeds into digital marketing and what you guys do, and we work on a lot of cross clients, so that helps.
We do.
Proof's in the pudding.
Indeed.
But it's part of a wider mix, and the sooner people realise that actually it can develop a brand in a slightly different way than they might have thought before.
Yeah. So we're going to do a few common PR misconceptions. So what would you say to the people, as I think this kind of circles back to what we just mentioned about the value of PR, but what would you say to the people that think there's little to no value, I'm not saying this, but little to no value in traditional PR, as opposed to maybe like digital coverage now? I suppose there's different benefits to both sides of PR. So what would you say to those that think there's less of it?
I think for what we have to remember is that target markets and target kind of every brand has this ideal customer, and the ideal customer will have a home life, a work life, a social life. You know, there'll be various different parts, and the way that they consume media in the different parts of their life is different. So, for example, they might be a banker in London and read the FT Monday to Friday, but they're probably reading the Daily Mail. I hate to say it, but they're probably reading the Daily Mail on Saturday, Sunday. And actually, a hotel client that I worked on did a survey of what newspapers their guests ordered at the weekend. They were there hoping it was the Times and the Telegraph. It was the Daily Mail and the Sun.
That's quite a damning study to take on your own business.
Yeah, I mean, but it's interesting. It's because it's easier reading in that sense. And actually, there's for kind of that sport section, that's actually where it comes from. But having said that, PR adds credibility, essentially.
Absolutely.
And actually, that's a huge part of it. And the way that we consume media, as you touched on, is so different. Digital, there's a lot of clickbait, a lot of kind of just scrolling and just kind of taking snippets, reading headlines.
Yeah.
In print coverage, it's it's more longer form. And so people are going to invest their time in reading it. And so actually, whether you get X amount of unique users on a website, that is just, it depends on the dwell time.
Yeah.
And if the dwell time's less, but then you can't, I mean, the hard thing with PR is you can't measure it.
No, it's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, woo!
We know the pain.
I love reports. Yeah. But yeah, so
some things happened this month. That's what I can tell you.
But yeah, so for print coverage, you know, it is looking at where your audience might be spending their kind of dwell time reading.
Yeah.
And also, I think there's a really big point here on how the media's changed. And even in the newspapers that are traditional print, there's online versions now. There's Press Reader, there's Readly. And so people are still reading print, but just in a different format. And so these kind of online, it doesn't have to be paper print, but these online programs and platforms that enable people to read digital print publications in a digital format.
Yeah, I suppose it's actually quite interesting. I'd never thought about how, if you looked at it as you got print and then you got digital, and the barriers to entry for digital, for example, for getting someone, you know, clicking onto an article and, you know, reading it and actually taking it all in, the barrier is clicking. But when it comes to print, it is literally, have you bought it?
Yeah.
So then the whole, you know, like, no clickbait title is needed. I've never actually thought of that. That's really interesting. Side note, where do you find the studies for hotels that like have wondered, you know, they've done a study on what paper their people order? Like, where does this come from?
It's from it's their actual data.
This.
Yeah, they haven't published it, but it was just in the marketing department. We were just interested because obviously every company, as I said earlier, has this target media list. There it is again.
Hey, sometimes.
And their target consumer, and actually putting the reality of that out, and it's a big thing in marketing to have this kind of persona, and everyone calls it something different, and there's always a weird name for their target consumer. But looking at that and then actually translating that into who is walking through the door, who's buying the product, is really interesting.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the study was just done within the marketing department because that's data that they have.
It's actually a really interesting study, and I feel like I don't know if it's strictly relevant just to hotels, but like there are other avenues that could be doing similar studies, and that would be far more useful for people like yourself trying to get coverage.
Definitely.
A question I have about coverage as a whole is there a magical way in the world of PR to get the publications to come to you? Is there some key marks you have to hit for, you know, the coverage to be generated for you?
It's tough, and I think unless you've got a really strong story, it's a PR's job to sell it into the journalist.
Yeah.
When you're doing your job really well, of course, you know, things take off and things not go viral. I wouldn't say go viral, but
it's a dangerous term to be using.
But they go beyond kind of what any PR team think about.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say is when you want to be in that position, which is everyone's dream.
Absolutely,
ideally,
yeah.
But the kind of back route to doing that, and this is just a personal thought, but is trade coverage. And I think it's really overlooked because trade coverage ultimately informs a lot of our national newspapers, magazines, regional titles. And so actually a lot of the big stories come out of trade titles from people putting themselves forward as industry leaders, saying stuff that's slightly out of the box, slightly different, slightly challenging, and therefore that develops into more of a story because people are then take that opinion and kind of ride with it. And that's how definitely, you know, I've done some bits with Truffle Hunter actually, and we've done some trade and regional bits, and we had quite a lot of publications, the Times and the Telegraph came to us on the back of a regional pitch because we were talking about kind of the difference that the pandemic had made, and also Brexit.
I suppose establishing yourself as a as an industry leader and a thought leader even, it can go a long way for like brand loyalty. Like people will take that on. Have you found that people have, you know, gone, well, they appear to know what they're talking about, I'm gonna ride or die almost for them and whatever they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that happens in print media, that happens in digital media, and even more so now that happens in social. I mean, we're talking about the 5 to 9, and that is exactly it. And people are also much more open-minded to listen to different opinions now, and I think different opinions when they're out of the box, incredibly out of the box as well, you know, it can't just be spouting anything.
It gets dangerous if you just let anything.
But that definitely helps inform the wider news agenda, and challenges the news agenda, and actually, especially in the world that we live in now, I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, I suppose, it's a blessing and a curse that we have so many different avenues of media that you can, like, on the good side, isn't you can make such an informed decision on, you know, whatever it is, because you have so many different places you can take information from. There's obviously the bad side of that, but we won't dive into that one. So we're going to jump into a bit about brand partnerships. I know that's a focus of yours. In your own words, what is brand partnerships? You know, what work does it entail, and how does it benefit brands?
So brand partnerships for me, again, are about adding credibility. So if you work with the right brand, you probably have quite aligned audiences, and therefore it's working together for mutual gain, I would like to say. And that's the best brand partnership, is when there is actual mutual gain. And talking to, as I said, a pretty specific normally audience that cross over in target, to talk about your USPs and also potential collaborations.
So I did a bit of research on brand partnerships. I wasn't too clued up, I'll admit. What would you say to brands? Firstly, would you ever consider, obviously they're in the same space or in the same industry, they could almost be a competitor. What would you say to the brands that are afraid to collaborate with a competitor? They don't want to give any sort of limelight to someone that they're going up against.
I would say, actually, if you take a step back, and this is what I do have to say to quite a few clients, is just
You've
take
rehearsed
a step
this,
back. I've said this one before. But actually, you're talking to an audience that is already engaged in your product. If they're a competitor, they already know why they want X, Y, and Z, or what the benefit is, or if it's a product, why they like it. So you're already talking to an engaged audience, and actually it gives you an opportunity to showcase in a slightly more subtle way kind of the USPs of the product, service, whatever, and look at, I mean, having said that, I think it has to be right on the money in terms of the idea and the actual concept of what the brand partnership looks like. But in terms of collaborating with, I think everyone's quite closed book with collaborating sometimes. And sometimes, again, it's taking a step back and just realizing that actually, if it's almost like you're a little shark and you're going to a pond full of little fish, like it's ideal, it's perfect, it's a great day out.
I'm sure it's just like a fine line with justifying it to them, like you want it to be mutually beneficial, don't you, for both businesses. So is it almost going to your client, for example, this hypothetical client that's come to you and go brand partnership, is it going to them, it's going to benefit you just as much as it's going to benefit them? It's not going to outweigh on one side.
Yeah, we do. So I've just done a piece of work with Rupert and from Philly Way, and we looked at brand partnerships and we looked at genuine brands that aligned with the philosophy, because I think that's a huge thing. If you align on philosophy, it becomes much more authentic, and you become more of an authentic ambassador as opposed to this kind of paid ad space. And we looked at that, and then we looked at what the mutual benefit could be. So whether that could be a blog post in quite a niche, for example, there was a clothing brand who had a journal, and every quarter they did recipes, and their food was all based around kind of wood fire cooking and outdoors and things. So we were so specific in terms of the output, and whether it could be a location for a photo shoot that we could offer so that they could get the photos for that, etc. So looking at it through both. And I guess that's where, taking a step back, being an external partner is really helpful to kind of develop those brand partnerships, because you can see it from both. You can see it from both angles.
Yeah, I suppose as if there was a business that had their own PR person, it'd be very easy for them to be almost blinkered, and not see the mutual benefit that you get from it. I think it would be interesting to talk about how you identify a brand partnership. I think you'd mentioned that, say for example, with Fill Away, that there was a clothing brand, did you say?
Yeah.
So they're sort of not necessarily in the same industry. Do you almost look at like, well, here's our, target persona. This is our target audience list of people.
Nailed it.
Thank you. And we're going to go, well, this is what their lifestyle is like. And then we're going to explore brands inside of that sort of
and
niche.
I think it's also about looking at who the spokesperson is for the company. So, for example, Rupert is an ex-rugby player, and he lives in Cornwall, and actually his lifestyle is very outdoorsy. So looking at what feeds him and what makes his kind of world go round, and just taking from that. And again, that's part of the process of PR, is really getting under the surface of brands, of people, of spokespeople behind brands, so that you can understand more about what makes them tick. And once you know that, the brand partners kind of come as a product of that. And I guess it's cred I sent over a list to Rupert, and I would say a good 75% of them were kind of tier 1 or 2, and for me that's such a good sign, because we know that we're both on quite a similar line, and we know where we're heading, and that what I think drives him and what I think his philosophy is true, because it's reflected in who he's picked. And so, I think there's huge merit in just spending time, and things don't happen overnight. And I mean, I don't have to.
I'm sure you've had that conversation before.
Many a time.
I think it's important to. There are many times I'm sure that you've had to almost, jump on a call with a client or go and meet a client just to make sure that you're on the same track. Do you find that you are having, is that part of your process, especially when it comes to brand partnerships? Is it right, okay, you need to really get inside the head of the spokesperson, the person who's running the business, and going, is this something that they do and that they can see as a vision? Yeah,
absolutely. With all of my clients, I try and either test the product or test the service, which I think a lot of people see as lovely, a nice night hotel stay, but it is definitely work in sense of understanding, in the eyes of a guest, for example, if you're a hotel, understanding why and having the conversations with people that are paying to be there. So having a conversation over breakfast as to, are you down, are you visiting, are you what made you pick here, and having those kind of on the ground conversations with the kind of the everyday consumers, but also with the clients. And the marketing managers for us are obviously the link, and sometimes there's a communications manager, but very rarely. And understanding kind of their ethos as well, and knowing what will, because understandably they've been brought on by the brand to do this external messaging, and so you need to learn everything through them. And it goes back to being human. I think it's so easy for people to see brand marketing managers as quite scary clients, and actually the minute you take them out for a drink, you realise that they're just people,
just a normal person.
And actually everyone's quite up for a laugh, and things happen if you trust someone, and I'm really lucky. I've got a really good roster of clients who really trust me in what I do, but we can have a laugh as well. And for me, that's a really important side of business, that having been in seen through various different friends, they all work in finance and law, and it's not like that. And actually having that rapport with clients means it's easier to tease out those stories, because you'll have conversations in the pub, not the club.
Not the club. That's well, for
maybe
later.
But you'll have these conversations, and then you'll understand more about what drives them and what they see success as too.
So I think it'd be good for those that are thinking of brand partnerships and the ideation that goes behind, from start to finish. If you could give me like a whistle stop tour of brand partnerships, someone's approached you, how do we work from here to the final collaboration?
Yeah, so the first thing I do is Google them.
Nice.
It's so straightforward. But see if there are any like Brewdog. Some people could get approached by Brewdog and be like, oh my god, this is amazing. And you look back and you're like, ooh, maybe
what
not.
A stinker.
Yeah.
What a stinker.
But that's a prime example. Google them, check that there's nothing that doesn't align with what you want to be seen as doing, and make sure that there's no red flags. And then I would always look at the socials, because that's normally quite a big part.
An indication,
and look at the website as well. Go see if there's a blog, see if there's any kind of honed content that they've already produced that you can see. I then also sneakily do a bit of a LinkedIn, because sometimes I think it's really interesting to see where people have been.
On the business or the actual people?
Both. So founders of businesses, I think it's really interesting to see where they've been, what they've done, because it might mean that actually, before the business as it is now, before that, what they might have done previously might align even more so, and actually bringing that experience makes it, again, it's just about finding the authenticity, which I guess can be easier said than done. But finding that and understanding kind of more about that, and then looking at socials, checking, and then also flicking through the media and seeing, in terms of, I've got portals now where I can type keywords in and see what brands are up to. But looking at that and seeing what other partnerships they've done, and if that aligns, again, a brand ultimately, if they partner with someone, is saying quite externally, this is what we want to be seen to be doing, and this is who we want to be seen to be, with want of a better phrase, in bed with. So actually, do you align with that as well? Because third party, that has to be
that is true, because you're almost part of it, aren't you? As a final question before we get into the quickfire questions that I'm sure you're very excited to take part in, newsjacking is quite a popular PR tactic. If you could explain it to me, for example, I know enough about it, but obviously not to a level where I'd be able to do it. How would you explain it?
So every morning I spend about an hour and a half reading the papers, looking through what's leading the news agenda, and from that, if there are any news stories that stand out. So for example, I actually didn't work on this with my clients. I'm not going to try and take it, but when Greggs came to Cornwall, so that was a big story.
Absolutely.
And shock horror. I still haven't been in the Truro one. I'm really proud.
I was personally fuming.
Yeah, I mean,
I wasn't, but a lot of people were.
A lot of people were. I've got Cornish Premier pasties and Prima bakeries, and
you
actually,
are fuming on their behalf.
I am fuming. And Mark from is a spokesperson for the CPA, the Cornish Pasty Association, and they did.
That was a thing.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. And they did a piece in Time Out off the back of this Greggs launch, and actually it was quite quick, and it was this Greggs launch in Cornwall really went viral.
It really ruffled a few feathers in Cornwall. It really did.
But he was then able to speak about actually the importance of making pasties in Cornwall and how kind of the actual heritage of that. So that's kind of slightly different example of newsjacking, but equally there are things that you can do with brands. So for example, Jubel actually, the peach beer, do it really well sometimes with
they do one recently for Brewdog.
Exactly, outside Twickenham.
That's the one. They used to hire someone's drive, didn't they? And they hand out Jubel and Brewdog and paid for it, and they brought a toilet along, wasn't it?
And you could chuck your Brewdog in and exchange it.
It was a knockoff Guinness, wasn't it?
So it was exactly. So it's kind of stunts like that you can do, but there's also more newsworthy not newsworthy, more news agenda led pieces where it's just adding comment as well, and you can do big wave stunts, but actually sometimes if you've got a really specific
some of the most
piece of
effective
insight,
pieces,
selling that in, and also noting not to sell it into the journalist that has just written about the piece, because I think this is where there's a real fine line between newsjacking and just selling in an opinion on a story that's already been written.
Sure.
And that is the fine line, and that's when you really need to check yourself, because it's one of the biggest bugbears for journalists is they've just written a piece. I mean, taking it back slightly, but they've just written a piece, for example, on like Valentine's Day gifts. Yeah. And then you're like, oh, I saw your piece on this. Can you include this? It's like, they're never going to do that.
That's a whole lot of use now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, putting that into newsjacking as well means that making sure that you're adding insight, or you're adding another version of the story, or you're kind of being quite clever in the way that you deliver your output, as opposed to just saying, here's another insight that you could have included in your piece, but it's already run. Yeah, sorry, it's too late. Yeah. Do you find that newsjacking could be like arguably like the quickest turnaround for like a piece of coverage? Like, that is it the quickest turnaround, do you reckon? Like, if you say, for example, you spend an hour and a half reading the papers today and you're, assessing where can my client go in at this point, it could be in tomorrow, couldn't it? It could, yeah. The sign-off process for newsjacking is tough. And I think that's when brands do it well, it's because they've got a really slick sign-off process. And is that where the trust comes in? Yeah, exactly. And I essentially am a brand ambassador for all of my clients, and actually knowing what they feel comfortable saying, what they don't feel comfortable saying. Yeah. So with newsjacking, a lot of the time I will see a story, kind of write an idea up, brainstorm an idea a bit, write out a potential response to then send to them for them to kind of get feedback. But if you're going to do that, so news meetings normally are done by about 11 o'clock. So you have a very finite period of time where you can pitch it in. And if it's, you obviously, it depends on the publication, but you have to be, pretty quick. So I think I actually glossed over one of my favourite questions that I actually had written down was, what makes a good pitch? Okay. For this, like, both client and to like the publication that you're trying to newsjack for. I guess it goes back again. Target media list. Hey, I think we've reached 10. Here we go. But knowing the publications, knowing what the slots are, and then knowing the journalist and understanding that it's a combination of all three plus the media. For example, something that works for Country and Townhouse isn't necessarily going to work for The Guardian. I mean, it won't work because the price points are different. Yeah. And knowing that, and knowing that, for example, The Guardian's top kind of hotel price is £130 a night. So knowing that, but also knowing that it's not going to necessarily sit in the FT weekend if it's in that 150 mark. That's true. So understanding the publication, knowing what makes them tick, knowing what is kind of having this foresight, which is a really weird thing to say, but having a trend in the bag before it's a trend, it's quite a tough one. I can imagine that's probably the most difficult aspect of it. So that's why I read. I don't always, when I'm reading the papers, it's not always just to find coverage or to kind of have a night. But I think people in the office just think I'm having a nice just lazy morning. But it's actually just to educate myself and understand more about what's going on. And for example, it's really important for me to know the goings on in the Ukraine-Russia war because of the impact that has on especially my FMCG clients, where price of goods is going up, and actually if there's industry comment on that, I need to be aware. And especially I've got an accountancy client as well, so obviously the budget and what happened with Liz Truss was tough. We won't delve into that. No, let's not. That's for another day. That's the After Dark podcast. We'll do that one. But that it had a huge impact on the way that we communicated these quite punchy financial stories. And so for me, monitoring the money pages is really important, and knowing politics kind of does sadly drive every part of FMCG, hotels, every industry that I dip into is such a big part. So when coming back to kind of what makes a good pitch, it's just understanding what's going on, what is of interest, and what could actually work, and what could work, and also the style in which the publication writes. So the Observer and The Guardian are quite similar in the way that they write, but so if we're looking at the food magazine, so Feast is the Guardian supplement and Observer Food Monthly is the food supplement for the Observer, and actually what they have in terms of content in the different publications is quite different. And so noticing that, and also knowing that if it's a supplement on a weekend, it's a longer format read. If it's during the week, a daily newspaper, it's a shorter format read.
Okay, Florence, just to round off the podcast, we normally end with quickfire questions, and this is where we really get to know what makes you tick.
Okay.
So we're going to lead with, what is your industry hot take?
So I think definitely coming up, well, it's already happening. ESG is being such a big kind of thing, especially in press, and greenwashing. And actually, I guess my kind of to challenge that is, how do you cut through the noise? And she did it.
It's the worst one I've ever seen. Carry on. Cut through the noise.
How do you cut through the noise, and how do you actually convince clients that just because a story sounds like it's going to be really good, what is the genuine value in that?
Yeah, I suppose that actually is, greenwashing is such a huge thing, and I feel like it's only going to get worse.
Yeah. But then I also think that there are people are becoming more aware of greenwashing.
This is
true. The plant a tree, for example, which was used by loads of airlines. I've actually seen Plant One, and they're doing a really good job at actually showing what that initiative could look like if it was taken seriously. But there are so many companies where it's easy to do. You book a flight halfway across the world. Oh, I'll pay £10 for a tree because that made me feel slightly better.
Yeah, I feel great now. Yeah. Thanks.
And actually, that tree is probably a nice factory in China.
Yeah, it's never being planted, is it? No, I suppose the challenge is for a brand that is wary of greenwashing is trying to be so authentic with it, and like having to justify everything you do that it doesn't come across as greenwashing.
Exactly, yeah.
My next quickfire question is, what is one thing you want to see become standard practice in the PR world? I've
got two. Controversial.
Hey, we're getting value of this podcast. Here we go.
Number one is honesty.
Yeah.
PR is a lot of promising the world and not always getting it. And I think actually sometimes just having really open and honest upfront conversations both ways works really well, and means that a program or a strategy can develop in actual real time as opposed to kind of ideations and wishes. I think that's a really important thing. And the second one, it's very basic, but thank yous. It
would go a long way. Yeah, I know what you mean.
I think service industry is particularly bad for being quite thankless.
Yeah.
I mean, PR is a really thankless industry. And I make a really big point sometimes, especially if it's bigger pieces. I had a piece in the Telegraph at the weekend, and the journalist went out of her way to make it happen. So I sent her a bunch of flowers, and it's not a lot, but actually it works really both ways. Yeah. And saying thank you, I think actually that's just like my wider. It's not PR industry.
It's just common courtesy. Yeah. Just say thank you.
But it's really interesting to see how that doesn't happen, and it's for me. Yeah, I guess it's slightly my moral high horse.
You got to rely on the goodwill of man, and this, that, and the other. I know what you mean. Final quickfire question is what is one thing you wish you knew before jumping into the world of PR?
It's almost like it's such a stupid one, but I never really thought about the news agenda being 24/7, and so for me, it's the one thing I really wish I knew is that actually there's no time off, and it's really hard.
I was gonna say that sounds pretty grueling.
Yeah, it's you are always aware of what's going on, so even when you've got stuff going on outside of work, it's being dictated by a lot of things. So I think everyone can see that the coronavirus slashed marketing budgets. That's one thing, but also for example, I used it earlier, the Ukraine-Russia war, the impact that has on my clients, and the very real impact on that, and actually how as I say, the news agenda is consistently. I remember it's nearly a year to the day actually that Russia invaded Ukraine.
I was going to say it's coming up to it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I remember it so well. I was actually in Spain with my godfather, and I remember just thinking, this is actually pretty detrimental to, and on a very horrible kind of top scale level business. And obviously there's a lot more to that, and there's more of a human approach of being incredibly worried for the civilians, but equally it's this knowledge that the news agenda is everywhere, and I love Christmas, and I don't actually like Christmas the festival, but I like Christmas because no one really works in marketing, and PR slows down, and a lot of that content is back backlogged. And actually that is the one time I can put an out of office on and not receive
and switch off
600 emails a day.
Yeah. Actually, as like a final off the cuff question, how do you feel like, do you like the fact that your day is always evolving because of the news agenda? Like, it is always moving.
Yeah, and no two. This is such a textbook. I get this. This will be used for the outtakes, I'm sure. Go. But no 2 days are the same.
Oh, good. Yeah.
As everyone likes to say, but it really isn't, and it is so dictated almost by third parties. Yeah. It's almost like I'm a little puppet to the news agenda. But it makes. I think also for me it's really interesting because I don't stop learning, and that's really important for me, and I do a lot of courses and I try and always better my skills, but equally I learn a lot from reading different sections of papers, magazines, listening to podcasts, webinars, because that is the best part of I'll be listening to this one back. Actually I probably won't, because I hate the sound of my own voice.
The thing is I feel like we've ticked off all of the buzzwords and catchphrases we possibly could in this podcast.
Oh, I'm sure there are some more.
I might actually make an external asset to go with it. Like, if you want to watch this and listen to this podcast, you have to play along as well. I think that just about rounds it all up for us. I think the last thing for me to do is thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me.
It was an absolute pleasure. I'm sure we'll have you back for a round table or something in the future. Lastly, thank the listeners and watchers for tuning in to this episode, and we will catch you on the next one.